What if almost everything you believe about national power is wrong? We are often told a simple story. Strong countries have strong currencies, and weak countries have money that is practically worthless. It is a comforting narrative, one that paints a clear picture of heroes and villains on the global economic stage. But what if this story is a carefully crafted illusion? What if a weak currency is not a sign of failure, but a devastatingly effective weapon? For decades, China embraced this very idea, deliberately devaluing its currency not out of desperation, but as part of a calculated grand strategy that would fundamentally reshape the world. To truly grasp the genius of this plan, we need to travel back to the late 1970s. China was just emerging from the turbulent shadow of Mao's Cultural Revolution. The nation was an isolated economic backwater, its industries were archaic, and its people were mired in poverty. Then a new leader, Deng Xiaoping, stepped onto the stage. In 1978, he launched a series of radical reforms that threw open China's doors to the world. Factories began to sprout along the coast, and foreign investment was eagerly courted. Beijing's objective was crystal clear: industrialize and do it faster than anyone thought possible. But there was a problem. How do you convince the world to buy your products when you are the new kid on the block? The answer was brutally simple. You make them so cheap they are impossible to ignore. This is where most people get tangled in a web of economic jargon about exchange rates and foreign reserves. So let us cut through the noise. Imagine for a moment that the Chinese yuan should naturally trade at 5 units to 1 US dollar. In a truly free market, as China's exports boomed, the yuan would become more valuable, maybe strengthening to 4 per dollar. This would, however, make Chinese goods more expensive for foreigners. China wanted the exact opposite. So its central bank, the People's Bank of China, stepped in and essentially forced the exchange rate to remain artificially weak, at times hovering around 8 yuan to the dollar. How did they pull off this financial magic trick? It was a massive, relentless operation. Every time US dollars flooded into China from the sale of exports, the central bank acted like a giant financial vacuum, sucking them up and selling yuan in their place. These dollars were then piled high in the country's foreign reserves, which, by 2014, had ballooned to an almost unbelievable peak of nearly $4 trillion. The outcome was a masterstroke of economic engineering. The yuan stayed cheap, Chinese products stayed absurdly cheap, and consumers in the West joyfully filled their homes with everything from toys to televisions, all stamped with Made in China. Think about it this way. It is as if a premium sneaker company, capable of selling its shoes for $100, decided to sell them for just $20 instead. In the short term, they would be sacrificing huge potential profits. But in the long term, they would bankrupt every single one of their competitors until they were the only game in town. This is precisely the strategy China employed with its currency. It deliberately undersold its own economic output to achieve absolute dominance over global manufacturing. And let me tell you, it worked spectacularly. Throughout the 1980s, 90s, and into the new millennium, this strategy paid incredible dividends. Chinese factories multiplied like mushrooms after a rainstorm, and its trade surpluses soared to astronomical heights. Western consumers were in paradise, reveling in the low prices. Giant retailers became cathedrals to this new era of globalization, their aisles overflowing with Chinese-made goods. But while Americans celebrated what they saw as a victory, cheap electronics, affordable clothing, inexpensive everything, the true victor was quietly consolidating its power. The cheap yuan made Chinese exports an unstoppable force, and here is the kicker. The dollars China earned were then loaned right back to the United States government. The irony could not be any sharper. And this is precisely the part of the story that the West consistently failed to understand. A weak currency was not a sign of a struggling economy. It was the engine of a meticulously planned ascent. By keeping the yuan artificially low, China did more than just sell t-shirts and televisions. It bought itself something far more valuable: time. Time to build gleaming cities and superhighways, time to modernize its industries, and time to pull hundreds of millions of its people out of poverty. It was playing the long game, a multi-generational game of chess, while its competitors were merely celebrating a short-term bargain. By the early 2000s, the results were impossible to deny. China had transformed itself from a closed, agrarian society into the undisputed factory floor of the entire planet. Its cities swelled with new life, its ports became the busiest on Earth, and its workforce churned out nearly everything the modern world consumed. To the casual Western observer, it looked like an economic miracle. To Beijing, it was simply proof that the plan was working. But a strategy this successful inevitably creates adversaries. In Washington, politicians began to cry foul, accusing Beijing of currency manipulation. And they were not wrong. China absolutely was intervening. But calling it manipulation makes it sound like a back-alley card trick. In reality, it was cold, hard geopolitics. A cheap yuan meant America's store shelves were full, but it also meant that its own factories were emptying out. Manufacturing jobs, once the bedrock of the middle class, began to vanish, migrating overseas to China. Entire towns in the industrial heartland were hollowed out, their foundations eroded. In the short run, the American consumer was king, enjoying an era of unprecedented low prices. But in the long run, the industrial base of the West was steadily dismantled, while China's industrial machine grew more powerful with each passing year. It was a trade-off that few at the time were willing to acknowledge. The twisted logic of the situation ran even deeper. Every single dollar an American spent on a Chinese-made product was another dollar that China could use to purchase U.S. government debt. Those enormous trade surpluses were not just sitting in a vault somewhere. China's central bank cleverly recycled them by buying U.S. Treasury bonds, which made it one of Washington's largest foreign creditors. This created a bizarre, symbiotic relationship of codependence. America would accuse China of unfair trade practices, while simultaneously relying on China to finance its own budget deficits. It was a perfect loop. China sold America cheap goods, then loaned America the money to buy even more cheap goods, all while quietly tightening its financial grip. This is where Western perception slammed headfirst into Chinese reality. In the United States, a strong dollar has always been treated as a national badge of honor, a symbol of economic might. In China, a weak yuan was never a source of humiliation. It was a tool. It was leverage. By sacrificing the empty prestige of a strong currency, Beijing gained the very real substance of industrial might and geopolitical influence. The West condescendingly talked about China's cheap labor and undervalued currency, failing to see that those were the foundational pillars upon which a new superpower was being built. While Western leaders were championing consumer choice, Beijing was thinking in terms of dynasties. Naturally, this high-stakes game was not without its dangers. The constant intervention in currency markets sometimes threatened to stoke inflation back home in China. It also painted a giant target on Beijing's back, leading to escalating trade tensions and repeated threats of sanctions from the West. But here is the brilliant part. By the time the West truly woke up to the strategic threat and decided to fight back, China had already accomplished its primary objective. It had achieved near-total dominance of global supply chains. From textiles to technology, from steel to smartphones, China was no longer just a participant in the global economy. It was indispensable. And that is when the strategy began to evolve. Around 2005, Beijing started to allow the yuan to gradually strengthen, just enough to pacify its loudest critics. By the early 2010s, it loosened its grip even further, a clear signal of newfound confidence. Why the change of heart? Because the first phase of the mission was complete. China no longer needed an absurdly cheap currency to corner the export market. It already owned the factories, the ports, the logistics networks, and the skilled workforce. The weak currency had been a ladder. Once China reached the top of the wall, it could calmly kick the ladder away. But make no mistake, the playbook was not thrown out. It was simply updated for a new era. Instead of relying solely on currency devaluation, China began applying the same core principle to entire industries. The new method: subsidize production heavily, sell at rock-bottom prices, flood the global market, obliterate the competition, and capture the entire supply chain. We have seen it in steel, then solar panels, and now electric vehicles. The specific products may change, but the strategic logic remains identical. Absorb short-term losses to secure long-term, irreversible dominance. Today, the ambition has scaled up once more. The ultimate goal is no longer just to be the world's factory, but to challenge the financial architecture of the world itself. Beijing is now aggressively promoting the use of the yuan in international trade, striking deals from the Middle East to South America. It has also developed a digital yuan, a move designed to bypass traditional Western-controlled payment systems and give the state unprecedented control over the flow of money. The dream is no longer just to sell the world cheap products. The dream is to create a world where the yuan is as trusted and essential as the US dollar, a world where Beijing helps write the rules. And this brings us back to the central paradox. In the West, a weak currency is treated as a mark of shame. Politicians proudly boast of a strong dollar or a strong euro, as if the exchange rate is a national trophy. But China demonstrated the profound truth that the opposite can be true. A weak currency can be a powerful weapon. By deliberately keeping the yuan cheap, Beijing built an industrial empire, bought itself precious time, and transformed the lives of hundreds of millions. It traded paper prestige for real, tangible power. And all the while, Western consumers, lost in the illusion of cheap abundance, were helping to finance the rise of their greatest economic rival. The lesson for our modern age is piercingly clear. Never mistake the number flashing on an exchange rate board for the full story. A weak currency does not always signify a weak nation. Sometimes it signifies a brilliant strategy. And in the grand sweep of history, it is strategy that ultimately wins. The tools change, but the game remains the same. Money is never neutral. It is and always has been an instrument of power. If this gave you a new way to look at the world, consider subscribing. The past is filled with answers to the questions of today, and I am here to show you exactly where to find them.